I'm Lisa Carlton, the founder of College Matchpoint.
And I'm Bob Carlton, the co-founder of College Matchpoint. Lisa and I work with a team of consultants at College Matchpoint, and every year we reflect on the admissions results from the previous year, from, in this case, the class of 2021, and try to look at the trends that we saw. This year, just like almost everything else in the pandemic year, was completely asymmetrical. Now, there are some reasons for that, but what that actually means is that schools that you had expected in the past might go one way, went in some cases somewhat differently, in other cases totally different. Why is that? One, test optional, something that all parents of high school students have probably heard of countless times now. Two, a student's increased ability to interact with the college virtually on an info session, different settings. And then finally, the carryover impact of deferrals from the previous class.
And while Bob has done a great job of laying out what happened this year and why, I think as you look at next year, we have to realize that probably the things that happened this year are not going to be the same next year. And so while we're talking about this year's asymmetrical results, it's important to remember this time next year, we'll probably be talking about next year's asymmetrical results.
Absolutely.
And so what are the trends that we saw? Because we do think there's some trends that are here to stay. One of them is test optional. Probably a year ago, many of our people watching this video might not have been as familiar, but most families are now familiar with the test optional term. And what we're guessing is that in the coming year, that test optional for many schools is going to continue to stay. What we saw with test optional last year is that it really varied by school. We saw some really great results of kids who went test optional. Now, we know last year, colleges didn't know if a student had actually been able to take the test or not. In the coming year, all the students will be able to take the test. So I think that may change it a little bit, but what we're really hearing from colleagues in admissions is that they like reading kids without test scores, and they feel like it's helped them create a broader, more interesting class.
Now, to submit or not to submit, that was the question for so many students in the fall of 2021. For the class of 2022, I think we learned a lesson, and that is it's really dependent on the school, their standards academically, and the student and where they fit. Again, you can't do a one-size-fits-all determination. It'll have to be involved student by student and school by school.
Absolutely. We also learned that, okay, if they're not going to be looking at test scores, what are they going to be looking at? Well, we noticed that it seems that many colleges then had to go deeper into the transcript. So they're looking at the students' grades, they're looking at the students' rigor. And by rigor, I mean, have they taken the most difficult courses available to them? And of course, a student chooses their rigor also based on their college goals. So again, as Bob said about test optional, the same is true for how much rigor a student should choose to do. That's really a student by student decision based on college goals.
Absolutely. Now, historically, student engagement has always been at the core of a holistic read. We all know how much more difficult this was for students this year in the middle of a pandemic. What we did see from this year's results is that colleges, many of them, valued students who were able to tell stories about going deep into things that engaged them. This might be a student who had a focus on an area of common good, either in the pandemic or a long-lasting commitment, connection to an academic major, or an area of intellectual curiosity.
Absolutely. And we especially saw this important for our computer science and engineers, that those students really get a very deep look at their the amount of engagement that they've had. And I think one of the things that we have always focused on is students who take initiative, students who are generators of activity. And that, I think, really did ring true this year.
Absolutely. Now, demonstrated interest has always been a consideration at some schools. This year, we saw a number of schools, not all, really try to look at it in terms of what's called yield. How many of the students that the school offered admissions to accept that offer of admissions? We saw students demonstrating not just interest, but knowledge, not just checking items off a list, but really being able to clearly articulate why it is that they're interested in that school.
And I think, as Bob said, that, students who took the time to demonstrate knowledge about schools, really, that gave them a bump up. And because colleges were looking at yield, the flip of that is students who might have been very qualified for a school, but they never took the time to engage with the school, that sometimes impacted their decisions. And we expect this trend to continue. Colleges are very focused on wanting to bring students to their campus who've shown an interest in that school.
Absolutely.
Now, where do we go from here? I think that's always a tricky thing. One of the things that we see is that as our students are entering this class, and they've heard the stories from last year, right? One of the most important things is that a student needs a broad college list, and a list of colleges that where they do have demonstrated knowledge of them, they would be excited to go to them, and they have a varying level of acceptance rate. And students who had a really nice broad list that was balanced fared much better this year than students who maybe thought, oh, I'm going to really throw a curveball here and see what happens. I think that's a pretty risky strategy in this landscape. Anything else you'd add, Bob?
Yeah, one thing that was so exciting was to see students consider and ultimately say yes to a broader range of schools. The asymmetrical results not just were from the college side, they were also from the student side. And we saw students in March, April, and even May consider schools that they would have never considered and get genuinely excited about the opportunity to be on that campus in the fall.
Absolutely. And I think that is exciting to see students broadening their scope and ultimately finding a really great fit, which is what it's all about. And so that's an exciting, I think, jumping off spot for next year. And especially as students are fully in person next year, having that ability to come in and increase their level of engagement and be back on campus and have a much wider range of activities. It'll be interesting to see what we're talking about in terms of results next year.
Absolutely.